Welcome to the 260th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Dan Koboldt, author of the series Gateways to Elysia. Stay tuned for the interview. This episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast is brought to you by Libro.fm. Libro.fm is the first and only company which lets you purchase audiobooks directly from your favorite local bookstore. Support your favorite local bookstore, and you can pick from more than 125,000 audiobooks, including New York Times bestsellers and recommendations from booksellers. You'll get the same audiobooks at the same price as the largest audiobook company out there. You know who I'm talking about, but you'll be part of a different story, one that supports your local bookstore. If you're new to audiobooks, they're the perfect way to get more books into your busy life. If you already love audiobooks and don't know what to listen to next, check out the recommendations and curated list from the people who know audiobooks best, your local bookseller. There's a special offer now for Reading and Writing Podcast listeners. Get 3 audiobooks for the price of one, $14.99, with your first month of membership. Just use the code RWPodcast. Again, that's Libro.fm, purchasing audiobooks from your local bookstore, and use the code RWPodcast. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Dan Koboldt, author of the new fantasy novel, The Island Deception, Book 2 of Gateways to Elysia, which has just been published. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Great. Well, can you read the first couple of pages of your first novel, The Rogue Retrieval?
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Great.
This is chapter 1, which is called Disappearance. On the night of his strange job offer, Quinn Bradley was making things disappear. He worked nights at an off-strip theater in Las Vegas, where show magicians came in 2 classes. One was the quick-fingered hack, the kind that copied everyone's tricks to use on drunken tourists. The second class, the true illusionist, ran less common. Illusionists were magic's elite, masters of distraction and misdirection. The strip drew them both from all over the world, just as its game tables and bright lights drew ill-fated gamblers. It was Saturday night, show night in Vegas, and the club was packed. Word about Quinn's new trick must have gotten around. The crowd was a typical Vegas mix, mostly marks, most of them drunk, half a dozen of the more persistent copycats, and talent scouts from 3 major casinos, easily picked out as the sober guys wearing $2,000 suits. Quinn surveyed the audience from a hidden alcove backstage. About damn time the casinos started scouting me. He'd been a second act off the strip for nearly 2 years, countless hours of practice and training in equipment design. They'd ignored him as long as they could because he was from here. Recruiting him wouldn't bring the fanfare of nabbing a performer from New York or London. But they can't ignore me any longer. Quinn Bradley? A man in a dark suit stood behind him. He was tall and wore the suit well. Light hair, delicate features, and that youthful, clean-shaven look of Nordic ancestry. You shouldn't be back here, Quinn said. Backstage was off-limits to everyone. The last thing he wanted was some wannabe poking around his props and equipment. We need to talk. He had a faint accent, definitely European, but Quinn couldn't place it. I don't know you, Quinn said. I'm Lars Thorson. He offered his hand. Quinn ignored it. He wasn't about to let a stranger touch his hand 2 minutes before a performance. Did you say Thor's son? Thorson. It's Swedish. And I'm probably not interested. The last thing he needed was a distraction. I'm about to go on, he said. You're going to get a job offer tonight. Well, I certainly hope so. You shouldn't take it. Why not? The company behind the offer, Thorson began. He glanced behind him, lowered his voice. Let's just say you don't want to get in bed with them. Quinn could have smiled. He knew what this was. Oh, but I suppose your employer can make a better offer. I'm not here to make you an offer. Then I'm not sure why we're talking. I'm doing you a favor, Mr. Bradley. Here. Thorson snapped his fingers once. A playing card appeared between them. Jack of spades. Decent sleight of hand for an amateur. He held it out. Not bad, Quinn said. He took the card and knew right away it wasn't a normal. Too heavy and not enough flex. What is this? A way to get in touch. When you realize you're in over your head, push down on the Jack's face, Thorson said. I'll think about it. Quinn made as if to tuck the card behind his ear, palmed it into his sleeve instead. If Thorson was impressed, he didn't show it. You'll regret taking their offer, he said. Trust me. Quinn chuckled. I grew up in Vegas. I don't trust anyone.
Great. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about The Island Deception, your second novel, which has just been published, how would you describe your new novel?
Oh, well, The Island Deception is the sequel to The Rogue Retrieval, from which I just read a little excerpt. And essentially, the whole premise of this series is that a big, powerful corporation has discovered a portal to another world. And they've kept its existence a secret, and they've been studying it for 15 years. The other world's inhabited, but they're like at a medieval state of technology. So the company has lost one of their employees through the gateway, and they, in the beginning of book one, they're assembling a retrieval team to go get him back. And so it has your couple military types and a cultural expert, but because this other world is at a more primitive state of technology, they also recruit a Vegas stage magician to sort of go along and pose as like a wizard on the other side. And that's Quinn Bradley. That's the main character of the series. So in book one, they go on this mission. And then in book two, The Island Deception, there's a second mission. And he's sort of recruited to go back and do more dangerous, more complex things in the other world. And of course, given reasons that he shouldn't say no. So it continues the story of the Rogue Retrieval, but is sort of a separate adventure.
Great. Well, what was your writing journey prior to writing your first novel, The Rogue Retrieval?
Well, that wasn't my first novel. It was just the first novel that I tried to do anything with. I started
tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I started about 8 or 9 years ago. I have been a reader forever. I've toyed with the idea of writing, and like most people have. And then I finally said, well, if I'm going to do this, I should try and get serious. So I took a fiction writing class, a night class. And that was Introduction to Fiction Writing, just the kind of class where you write 2 stories and have them workshopped in the class and have an instructor who provides some guidance and that sort of thing. So that was how I got started. I took that class. I took the next one, which was advanced fiction writing, even though we weren't really advanced at that stage. But one piece of feedback I kept getting, because I was writing sci-fi and fantasy stories, was that they felt like part of a bigger story. And so I figured that was a good sign that I should maybe try writing a novel. And it just happened to be November when this occurred to me, and NaNoWriMo was starting up. That's National Novel Writing Month. Have you heard of that?
Yes, I have. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. So I thought, well, I'll give this a whirl and try and write a 50,000-word novel in the month of November. And I was able to do it. I really enjoyed the process. So I started doing that every year, and I sort of shifted into focusing most of my energies on novel writing. So in 2012, for NaNoWriMo, I started writing this new book that would go on to become the Rogue Retrieval. So it took me I started in NaNoWriMo, and then I finished it about a year later. And then after that, it was sort of a classic journey, querying, and found a literary agent who put it out on submission. And sometime later, we got an offer from Harper Voyager to pick it up. And that was picked up as just a single book, but with an option on my next one. So after the Rogue Retrieval had just come out, I sent my editor my manuscript for what I thought I would do for book 2 and a proposal for book 3. And he said, let's do both. So it became a trilogy.
Great. So are you working on the third book now?
Yes, I am. I'm actively writing it right now. It's due in the summertime. So it will sort of end the main story arc for this series. So it should be what I hope is a satisfying ending for anyone that's been with me for book 1 and book 2.
Great. And so what has been your experience in terms of process of the NaNoWriMo? Had you written much of a plot outline, or do you just kind of go where the story leads you, so to speak?
The first few I did, it was really just I had a concept in mind and I just went with it. And I think NaNoWriMo was good for that because it forces you to, you have to get words on paper every day consistently to have a shot at making 50,000 words. So I think that was a good sort of training exercise for me to start like, okay, sure, getting into the practice of writing every day and not trying to go back and edit and make it perfect when it's just the first draft. So I think that was important for me as a writer to kind of just get practice in the craft and to train myself to do that on a regular basis. More recently, I've been trying to at least have a rough plan for what story I'm going to write and what the major plot points are. I'm a fan of that Larry Brooks story structure. So I try to adhere to those tenets of like the different aspects and elements of a story structure. I don't always do it because NaNoWriMo is crazy and you don't always get to write exactly as you planned. But it's at least part of my process to try and plan it out a little bit in advance.
Gotcha. So, as you explained earlier, your books have this fantasy realm that you said is medieval. Were there fantasy writers that you had enjoyed reading that maybe you had in mind when you started working on your first novel or the Rogue Retrieval specifically?
Well, that's an interesting question because, I've read a ton of fantasy, and of course you want to aspire to be like the greats. I like Tolkien and Terry Brooks and some of the big names of classic epic fantasy. Raymond Weiss is one of my favorite authors. I wanted to kind of create my own world, but I'm never going to get completely away from those influences. More modern authors that I really enjoy reading are Scott Lynch and Patrick Rothfuss and Joe Abercrombie. And so I was reading books by them when I was either planning or writing the books in my series. So I'm hoping some of that awesomeness somehow seeped through.
Sure. So, given your experience to date of taking that class and then doing the NaNoWriMo and then finally selling your first book, well, obviously selling a trilogy, but what advice do you have for aspiring writers who may be listening?
Well, the advice I'd like to give is for people to find and make friends with people who are at a similar stage in their writing journey, to have as kind of your support network, emotional support network, because you will need that. And it's also a good source to find critique partners, which I think are immensely valuable. But, everyone needs to have sort of their inner circle of friends who understand what it's like to try and be a writer who's trying to break in the modern age of publishing, and who will also be your most ardent supporters in the event that you get somewhere and actually have books or stories that come out. So, make friends with other writers is my chief piece of advice.
Great. So what books, fiction or nonfiction, have you read recently that made an impression on you and that you would recommend?
Well, right now I'm reading the 5th season by Nora Jemisin, which really doesn't need a recommendation from me because it won a Hugo Award. But I'm really enjoying that. For this current, we're in like late spring, early summer. I'm currently reading a lot of sort of the award-nominated works or award-winning works, just because that's in my head and I have to vote for some of them. So I'm also reading some short fiction from places like Clark's World and Galaxy's Edge magazine and Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine. But before the 5th season, I read some good books last year. I read All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie Jane Anders, which is another awards-nominated work. And I also read Arabella of Mars, which is closer to like a YA, but sort of YA Victorian space travel. I don't really know how to, I mean, the book kind of defies any categorization, but that was another book that I enjoyed recently. And I've also been reading some books from my fellow Harper Voyager authors, like Michelle Hawke's Grudging and Faithful. She got started with Voyager about the same time I did, and she writes truly epic fantasy in a lovely secondary world. So I've been reading some of her work. And Bishop O'Connell's Fairy series that he writes for Harper Voyager is also really good.
That's great. Well, you mentioned earlier making the shift from early short stories to writing novels. Have you subsequently gone back and written any short stories, or do you have any interest in doing that?
Oh, yeah. I like to dabble in short stories. I have 2 or 3 that are going to come out this year, actually. I feel that either I'm not very good at it or it's just very hard to sell a short story, maybe both, in the current market. I have not had much luck with traditional magazines, although I did sell a story to Galaxy's Edge that hopefully is going to come out this year. I do really enjoy being part of themed anthologies, though. That's where I've had the most success in writing and selling stories, and also it sort of means that there's a product, like a book, that you can point to as something that has some of your work in it, and then you can help promote and be a part of with the other authors who put a story in the anthology. So I've done a couple themed anthologies with Third Flatiron, and it's just been an enjoyable process. So I think I will have, by the end of this year, I'll have like 5 published short stories. So I still dabble in it. It's I feel that when I look at what a short story pays, it's hard for me to versus what it takes out of me to write one. I'm like, no, I should really be focusing on the books, but I can't get away from it entirely.
Gotcha. So if someone is interested, where can they find you online?
Well, the easiest place to find me is my website, which is dankoboldt.com. I'm also out and about on Twitter and Facebook, so I'm easily found there. And occasionally you can see me in person at events in and around the Ohio area, so that's another place to look out for me.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Dan Koboldt, author of the new fantasy novel, The Island Deception, Book 2 of Gateways to Elysia. The novel is in bookstores now, so go grab a copy or buy the ebook. And Dan, thanks for doing this interview.
Hey, thanks so much for the invitation. This was fun.
Hello, this is Discover, and we take customer service very seriously. We know that if you have a question or concern about your credit card, that's a serious matter, and you need to talk to a real person about it. So we offer around-the-clock access to seriously talented representatives in the USA. Again, it's a serious endeavor. The only funny thing about it is Bob. If you call us and Bob answers, you're in for a treat. Get 100% US-based customer service and talk to a real person day or night. Discover. Exceptionally common sense. You know when you order a new video game, or a golf club, or a blender, and then it arrives at your door, you get a little thrill. Imagine how much more thrilling it is when you order a new car. With Nissan at home, you can shop for the perfect ride and order it without ever having to go anywhere. Sure beats a golf club or a blender. Buy a new car entirely online with Nissan at home. Delivered direct from dealer to driveway. Thrill starts here. Services may vary at participating dealers, subject to applicable law. See dealer for details.